Jade Wallace is the author of several chapbooks and poetry collections, and their work has been published both nationally and internationally in literary journals. Jade has also been a finalist and recipient of several literary prizes. In addition to their independent success, they're also a member of MADE, a collaborative writing entity they co-founded in 2018. Okay, thank you so much, Jade, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And to start off, would you like to do a reading?
I would like to read a poem from the section called Vanishing Beach. And this poem is called Creatures That Were Not. Sprite. After a heavy fog, there is a second fog, fragmented. Pearls of mist cling in cloudy strings to all the formerly unseen spider webs, and the forest is suddenly full of sprites. Puffin. A large bird is sitting on a rock that is half submerged in seawater. The bird looks like a puffin, which makes no sense in this harbor. I trip a bit on the beach shale as I'm hurrying down to identify the bird, and it flies off at the sound of clattering. It was probably a big duck. Mammoth. The rocks uncovered at low tide are a herd of woolly mammoths with their backs to the cold. When I step on their spines, thick hairs of seaweed squelch and slip away in sheets, threatening to take me with them. I learn not to do it again. Crow. According to your father, the 5 crows of the harbor meet and converse at the home of his neighbor who feeds them. But I see the crows every time I walk through the woods behind your father's house, and I swear they're trying to talk to me. It is from Love is a Place, But You Cannot Live There, my first book, which is not even quite officially out yet, but will be officially out April 1st and does exist and is real, and you can order copies and such.
Awesome. Yeah, I was just going to mention to viewers that, yep, you do have that book coming out. It will be available in local bookstores, and we'll also have copies here at the library.
Oh, that's wonderful. As you mentioned in my bio, I've done several chapbooks before, but this is my first full-length book, at least the first full-length book that will ever make it into the world. I did a few practice runs first. Those shall not see the light of day. But this book, Love is a Place, But You Cannot Live There, it is a poetry collection. And it's really focused around this idea of psychogeography and travel. And so psychogeography is a concept basically that people and their environments are kind of constantly mutually informing each other. And also the idea that there are different real ways of seeing and perceiving the environment around you. And psychogeography really emphasizes sort of trying to see it through kind of like fresh eyes, like not just letting yourself become really jaded and sort of habitual in the way you react to the environment, but really constantly trying to see it in all of its nuance and its newness. And so that's on the more serious side of what the poems are about, but on the more fun side, they're about things like amateur ghost hunting and going on trips to New York with your mother, and other things that like kind of go awry as we try to like travel around with other human beings. I would say the first 4 sections are kind of personal poems. They, I take some poetic license or whatever, but they're basically things that have happened between me and various people. The last section, though, is a little bit more expansive. I write about sort of some things that I might not have firsthand experience of. Like there's a poem about Antarctica. I've never been to Antarctica. I did a bunch of reading about it, and that's how I wrote the poem. But yeah, the poems all do tend to really focus on like the individual, which is usually me, and then their relationship with like another person that they are close to. And there tends to be like a lot of dialogue and sort of conversation that happens in the poems as the people like reflect their experiences back to each other.
Would you say that there was anything in particular that inspired you to write the poems, or?
I have to say the most true and banal answer is probably just that like when you are on any kind of vacation, even if it's a 2-day road trip in Ontario, you tend to have some time on your hands as you're like staring out the window at the grass and the trees rushing past you. and your mind kind of wanders. And so I always found that kind of headspace very productive for writing. And so I ended up with most of the sections of the book being like these suites of poems I wrote. I started thinking about them as I was traveling, and then I kind of finished them up when I would get home. And I would just, the things from your travels that you just can't stop thinking about even once you're home. That was what sort of made it into the poems.
So in hearing that, do you think that you're more creative, like in a comfortable space that's familiar to you, or more so outside seeing new things?
So I think the spark of new ideas definitely comes from being amidst unfamiliarity, but the actual time and energy it takes to create really, I think for me at least, demands a certain level of comfort and reflection that I mostly only get when I'm at home. So I do a lot of my like pre-writing in my head when I'm out, and then I do a lot of my actual work part when I'm at home in my room.
Is there anything that you do to like get yourself really ready to sit down and have a really long writing session?
I'm probably bad at really long writing sessions, honestly. I kind of more just sit down and keep writing till I get bored with myself. But I guess to prepare, I would say the biggest thing for me is just having to mentally let go of whatever else is bothering me or preoccupying me. And whether that's like writing it down and being like, I will get to it later, I've got a plan to deal with it, or whatever, like just putting all of that kind of noise, both literal and figurative, of daily life outside of the room when I'm sitting down to actually work.
That's interesting. I feel like that's something that people don't often think about when they're trying to get something done, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're part of this writing entity called Made. Would you like to share a little bit more about the collaborative process and your experience?
Yeah, for sure. So Made was started by my partner and I. My partner is Mark Liberty. He's a writer and an artist and designer. And so he's got his whole solo practice that he's been developing for many years, and I've got my solo practice. But back in 2018, we did decide to start writing together. And I think probably at the beginning, it was just more like on a lark, like, let's see what happens. But we found it to be a really creative, productive space. And we found that like we write poetry, which we both write individually as well. So it was like familiar territory for us. And yet whenever we were writing together, we really found that there was this kind of like what we like to call a third voice. That Made has, that doesn't really sound like me and doesn't really sound like Mark and doesn't even really sound like a combination of us. It's just this other like style we kind of write in only when we're writing as Made. And so that's been really interesting to me to see how it develops, especially because we've taken on a lot of different projects over the years. We have our first poetry collection was more like kind of just like a traditional lyric poetry themed. It's about sort of the malleable line between human and animal life, and it's called Zoo, and it's forthcoming with Windsor's Palimpsest Press. When we sort of finished writing that, we really moved in many different directions. So like one of the projects we're working on now, for example, is called Waste Not the Marrow, and it's actually a collection of these like collage sculptures, which is basically like where you take a bunch of objects and turn them into a kind of sculpture made up of other things, and then paired with poems. So that's really drawing on like Mark's background as a visual artist, and then we're writing collaboratively like about the objects. And so each project we take on really forces us to flex and develop sort of different skills. But constantly, it's really interesting working with another person because they are always bringing in like expertise and ideas and perspectives that like you yourself don't have and don't normally have to work with at all in your own writing. But suddenly you need to find ways to like really respect and incorporate another person's priorities as well, and also respect your own, of course. And so it's I find it a very interesting challenge, and also a really wonderful opportunity to use that real wealth of like ideas between you, and then to make something that you would never be able to make on your own.
It's like I did read the word entity, but hearing you explain it, it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, entity. It's kind of a word. I mean, we played around with different things. We had collaborative writing partnership for a while, which seemed like a very literal sort of depiction, but we really like this idea of an entity, like almost like a creature unto itself. Like it just, to go back to that idea of third voice, like the entity speaks to it being almost an individual of its own. Like it starts to take on a life of its own in a way.
So since your earlier works, how do you think your writing style and your creative process has changed?
Well, you were asking earlier about the work being autobiographical, and it's true that a lot of the poems in this book are very personally influenced, but the older I get, I find the more I really move away from that. And not that obviously like who you are as a person informs what you're interested in and all of that, but I'm not as much interested in writing about myself. I do occasionally, but I'm very much more outward focused. And I really blame this on the fact that I think in your 20s, it's like you're trying to figure out who you are and where you fit in the world, and you have all these existential questions. And so that is reflected in the writing. But like the older you get and the more sure you become of who you are, the more you're interested in knowing, I think, more about the world around you and what's going on, and yeah, all of that, like just this outward looking kind of writing. I think that's for me the biggest change I've noticed over time. And I would also say as well, like I've definitely moved more into fiction. Like when I did my master's thesis at the University of Windsor, I actually did a novel rather than poetry, which was a new thing for me. It was my first novel, which I finished, and I'm just sort of working on finding its place in the world. So there's the move to fiction, but also like I find my poetry is a little bit more daring. Like I started to get bored of my own style of writing, and so I'm constantly like trying to push it in new directions that seem interesting to me. It's more experimental, more challenging to read, honestly, probably. So that's good and bad, but I enjoy having like new things, new problems to solve, put it that way. I don't want to write the same poem over and over and over again for the rest of my life. So
as a writer, do you have any tips or advice or warnings for people who may be interested in pursuing a career in creative writing?
a warning. I love that. I guess my warning would be, if you don't love it, don't bother. It's about as likely to be lucrative as winning the lottery as you'd be better off playing the lottery. But if you do love it, I think it can be extremely rewarding, but you really have to push and search to like find those rewards, in the sense that obviously if you love to write for yourself or like your friends or whatever, that's wonderful. Like that can be its own thing as well. But if you're interested in sort of becoming part of a larger like literary community or conversation, there is a lot more to it than just like you write some poems and hope someone sees them. I think there's a lot of really integrating yourself into different literary spaces. So the library, for example, I think is a wonderful place where like events are happening and people connect. But there are other spaces and other ways that happens as well. Like literary magazines, I think, are a great example of this, where they bring in a lot of like volunteers and people to get involved with them, and then they also bring in, of course, writers to write for them. And so, like, for example, I volunteer. Volunteer is probably the wrong word, but I'm the book reviews editor for Carousel magazine. I've been doing that for the last couple of years, and before that I worked as kind of like an editorial assistant for them. And that's been one way. Like I've just gotten to know so many writers that way, because I'm doing research, I'm looking at what new books are coming out, seeing what we might want to review for Carousel. Sometimes I'm reviewing them, sometimes I'm like trying to find reviewers who are interested in working with us. And I probably, like a lot of writers, that's not really my comfort zone. My comfort zone is at home by myself reading a book. But I find that really like pushing yourself to try to like explore the literary world around you, even if it's just the very local one, is so educational, of course. I mean, you just learn so much more about what's going on around you, and even like where your writing fits in with all the other writing happening. But also like you just discover a lot of new things that, there's like books or styles of writing or whatever that I probably would have never been interested in if I didn't go and search them out. And so integrating yourself into like a community or many communities, or even just hanging around the fringes of a community, I think is just one of the things that is so vital to like being an active writer, like if you want to do that for years to come. But yeah, counterintuitive, I guess.
So we talked about your forthcoming poetry book, also about your about Made. Is there anything else that you've been doing that you'd like people to know about? Or
so that's a good question. I guess to bring Carousel back into it, I am actually very proud of our book review section. We usually do one review a week, almost every week of the year. So we have a lot of reviews happening. They're over on our blog. So Carousel Magazine, we're pretty easy to find on social media. And we've got a website and a blog, and there are lots of different ways to connect with us. Yeah, it's just to tell people, I guess, a little bit about the section, because I actually think it's kind of special in terms of review sections. So a lot of review sections are pretty like standard essays. They tend to be a fairly regular length and that kind of thing. But we really try to push the bounds of like what even counts as a review. So one of the focuses we've had since I started there was experimental reviews, where we try to like look for people who are writing reviews that might not even take the form of an essay. They might take some other form entirely. Like we've had people who do comics as a review, or people who make a sound poem and they try to turn that into a review, or they write a short story, or whatever it is that tries to really respond and engage with a particular book. And I think it's really fun to try to frame those as being like part of a literary conversation about books. So that's one thing we do. And then the other thing we do is we actually have a reviewer in residence program, where we'll have one reviewer and they'll write like a set of reviews for us for that month. So we get to show review after review by the same person and sort of contextualize it in terms of their broader career. And that for me has been really important, because I think book reviewers are a little bit underrated these days. And I just really I like the idea of drawing attention to them and sort of saying, look, like book reviewing as like a practice is its own thing. Like different reviewers have really different styles. And I think we need to appreciate sort of it as its own genre. And so by having like one reviewer where you get to see a bunch of work from them, and then another reviewer, you get to see a bunch of work from them, you can sort of like start to see maybe patterns and like how different approaches to reviews can affect, the way we're sort of shaping a conversation around a book.
Thank you. I think there will definitely be some library patrons who will check that out, and maybe some librarians as well. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. I would love that.
So before we close up, would you like to do another reading?
Sure. So I think I'll read one. I've got a section about, as I mentioned before, my trip to New York with my mom. And I think I'm going to read one from there because she took me to a lot of libraries as a child. So I feel like it would be an appropriate choice for a library interview. So this is also from my book. I'm just going to read from my book for tonight. The section is called Cynic's Guidebook, because I have to say New York on the whole is not my favorite place, but I did really nevertheless appreciate having a chance to go there. And it was somewhere my mom had always wanted to go, and I was very curious about it. And so it was a very interesting experience. I'm going to read one that it might sound a little bit cynical, as the title of the section suggests, but I will say, I think for me, like what really underlies this poem is like the fact that I cannot believe how patient my mother is with me sometimes. So this one's called The Importance of Choosing Suitable Traveling Companions. Our hotel room is the size of a walk-in closet, but is nevertheless comforting after a day full of the clamor and aggressive largeness of the modern Gomorrah. As my mother is turning out the light above the top bunk on our second night in the city, she says, "There is no one I would rather be here with than you," which is nice of her, but only reasonable when you consider the particular deficiencies of her other friends and relatives. So far on our trip, I have treated all food with deep suspicion and have only ingested items that are both carbohydrates and sealed in a bag prior to consumption. My mother has, accordingly, resigned herself to salads inhaled in the hurried intervals between activities more important than basic sustenance. I've done her the further disservice of waking up early every morning, preparing myself completely to go out, then falling back to sleep for a full 2 hours when she leaves for 10 minutes to shower. Once we finally make it out of the hotel, I slouch around the tourist attractions, making contemptuous noises. I am also afraid of heights, which is why my mother is currently commenting on my aptitude for travel as she prepares to sleep in the top bunk next to a chatty air conditioner. On the other hand, my mother cannot walk a full city block without stopping to take a photograph, a habit that, after the 50th block on any given day, makes me almost feel like we have earned each other.
I love that one. That one was funny.
Oh, thank you. My mother found it funny, so she was not
Well,
offended by it.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
So once again, Jade Wallace, poet and author. You can find their work at Windsor Public Library and at local bookstores, also online. I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to chat. And I look forward to reading your poetry once we get it in.
Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed our conversation.